The restaurant was buzzing with the chatter of well-dressed guests, the clinking of fine silverware against porcelain plates, and the soft hum of jazz music floating in the air. The chandeliers cast a golden glow over the room, illuminating the neatly folded linen napkins and crystal-clear wine glasses that decorated each table. It was a place where the wealthy dined, where the elite gathered to flaunt their status, and where the scent of luxury was as strong as the aroma of freshly grilled steak. In the midst of it all, Richard Alden sat at the center of attention, as he always did. He was a self-made millionaire, known for his sharp business instincts, expensive taste, and an ego that could fill the entire restaurant. His suit, tailored to perfection, hugged his broad shoulders, and his wristwatch, a limited edition Rolex, gleamed under the soft lighting. To the outside world, Richard was the very definition of success. A man who had built an empire from the ground up, a man respected, feared, and admired. But tonight, all of that was about to change. Across the table from him sat Margaret Alden, his mother, a frail woman in her 70s, her silver hair neatly pinned back, her aged hands trembling slightly as she lifted her teacup. Her eyes, once full of warmth, held a quiet sadness, a sorrow only a mother could carry when she looked at the son she had raised. Richard had invited her here tonight, but not out of love or respect. No, this was merely a formality, a dinner, to discuss business. He had always viewed relationships as transactions, and his own mother was no exception. As the waiter poured fresh wine into Richard's glass, his phone buzzed on the table. A message from his assistant. Everything is finalized. The house will be sold next week. Richard smirked, satisfied. Margaret's house, the very home she had lived in for over 40 years, was about to be sold off. She had begged him not to do this, pleaded with him to let her stay in the only place that held memories of his late father. But Richard didn't believe in sentimentality. The house was a valuable asset, and in his world, assets were meant to be liquidated for profit. Margaret took a deep breath, gathering the courage to speak. Richard, I raised you in that house. That's where you took your first steps, where we celebrated every birthday, where your father— Richard cut her off with a wave of his hand. Enough, mother. This is business. You should have prepared. For this, Margaret's eyes welled up with tears. How can you be so heartless? The table grew quiet. Guests seated nearby exchanged glances, sensing the tension thickening between mother and son. Some turned their heads discreetly, while others listened in silence. Richard leaned back in his chair, exhaling sharply. Heartless? Mother, I built my life from nothing. I made sacrifices. And look where I am now. Do you think I got here by being soft? By clinging to the past? Margaret reached across the table, placing her wrinkled hand over his. But you weren't always like this. You were a kind boy once. Your father would be ashamed of what you've become. Something snapped inside Richard. He yanked his hand away, and without thinking, his palm struck her cheek. A gasp rippled. Through the restaurant, forks clattered against plates. The jazz music that once filled the air now seemed distant, drowned out by the collective shock of the onlookers. Margaret recoiled, her frail body trembling. Her face burned from the impact, but the pain in her chest was far worse. She had given this man life, nurtured him, sacrificed for him, and this was how he repaid her. Richard, realizing what he had done, clenched his jaw. He wasn't the type to feel remorse. He had spent years hardening himself, convincing himself that emotions were a weakness, and yet, as he looked around, he saw the disgust in the faces of the people watching. But one face stood out. In the far corner of the restaurant, a man sat in the shadows, his gaze locked onto Richard, like a predator sizing up its prey. He was dressed in black, his expression unreadable, but there was something about him, something unsettling. He had seen everything, and Richard had no idea who he was. At that moment, Richard felt a shiver crawl down his spine. For the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar, fear. Because some actions don't just disappear. Some mistakes come back to haunt you. And Richard Alden was about to learn that lesson the hard way. Richard's fingers curled into a fist as he sat there, feeling the weight of every set of eyes in the restaurant pressing down on him. His heart pounded. Though he refused to show it, his entire life had been about control. Controlling his image, his wealth, his power. And yet, in a single moment, he had lost control. Margaret, his mother, sat frozen. She didn't touch her cheek, though it was burning red from his slap. She didn't cry. Instead, she just stared at him with an expression that made his stomach turn. Disappointment. It was the same look she had given him as a child when he had lied about stealing money from his father's wallet. The same look she gave him when he had refused to visit his father in the hospital during his final days. The room was eerily silent, except for the distant clatter of dishes in the kitchen. Then, after what felt like an eternity, Margaret quietly pushed back her chair and stood up. She wobbled slightly, her old bones weak, but she steadied herself. Without a word, she turned and walked away. Richard exhaled, trying to convince himself that he didn't care, that he had done nothing wrong. She was being unreasonable. She should have known better than to challenge him like that. But his confidence wavered as his gaze drifted toward the dark figure still sitting in the corner of the restaurant. The man had not moved, had not looked away, had not even blinked. He simply sat there, watching. Something about him felt wrong. Richard straightened his tie, trying to shake the feeling off. He signaled for the check, eager to leave, but when he turned back toward the corner, the man was gone. That night, Richard returned to his penthouse, a sleek glass fortress overlooking the city. The view was breathtaking, but he barely noticed it as he stepped inside. Something about the night's events had unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite place. He poured himself a drink, the ice clinking against the glass as he took a slow sip. Why was he letting this get to him? He had done what needed to be done. Business was business. His mother would be fine. She always was. And yet, as he loosened his tie and sat down on the plush leather couch, a strange unease lingered in his chest. Then his phone rang. He glanced at the screen. No number, just unknown caller. His brow furrowed, but he answered. Who is this? There was silence on the other end. Then, a low voice, calm and deliberate. You shouldn't have done that. A chill ran down Richard's spine. He stood up, his grip tightening around his phone. Excuse me, a soft chuckle. Then the voice continued. Your mother deserved better. Richard's pulse quickened. He walked toward the massive windows, peering out into the city lights. Listen, I don't know who you are, but click. The line went dead. Richard slowly lowered his phone, his mind racing. Who was that? And then he remembered. The man in the restaurant, the way he had stared at him, the way he hadn't moved. A nervous laugh escaped Richard's lips. This was ridiculous. He was being paranoid. It was probably just some internet nobody who had seen a video and wanted to mess with him. These things happened when you were rich and famous. People always had opinions. Still, something about the voice unsettled him. It wasn't just a random threat. It felt personal. Shaking off the feeling, he turned off his phone and headed for his bedroom. He would deal with this in the morning, but as he pulled back the covers and climbed into bed, the unease remained. And in the darkness, somewhere beyond the city lights, someone was watching. The next few days passed uneventfully. Richard drowned himself in work, meetings, and deals. The slap, the restaurant, the phone call. He convinced himself that it didn't matter. His mother would move on just as she always had. But then, strange things started happening. First, his assistant quit without warning. A woman who had worked for him for nearly 10 years simply sent an email saying she was no longer comfortable working under him. No explanation, no negotiation. Then, his business partners started canceling meetings, avoiding him. Deals that had been set in stone suddenly collapsed without reason. Clients stopped returning his calls. At first, he assumed it was coincidence, but then he noticed something that made his blood run cold. One night, as he was working late in his office, he looked at his security feed. The cameras outside his building showed nothing unusual, just the occasional car passing by. But then he saw it, a man, dressed in black, standing perfectly still near the entrance of his building, the same way he had been in the restaurant, watching, waiting. Richard's hands clenched into fists. He wouldn't be intimidated. Whoever this was, they were playing some stupid game, and he wouldn't fall for it. But then a new email arrived in his inbox. No sender, no subject, just a single line of text. You took everything from her. Now it's your turn. Richard sat frozen, staring at the email. The words on the screen seemed to breathe, crawling into his mind, refusing to be ignored. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. But what could he even say? There was no one to reply to, no sender, no trace of where the message had come from. A part of him wanted to dismiss it. Just another sick prank. Maybe some disgruntled employee, or an internet troll looking to rattle him. But deep inside, he knew better. This wasn't random. This was personal. His breathing was uneven as he leaned back in his chair, trying to think. He needed to get ahead of this. Whoever this was, they were watching, waiting. They wanted him to feel fear, and he refused to give them that power. But as the days passed, it became harder to ignore. His company stock started plummeting overnight. His bank accounts, ones he had kept airtight, were suddenly flagged for investigation. Business. Deals collapsed before they could even begin. He was losing control, and fast. Then came the whispers. People he had worked with for years suddenly wanted nothing to do with him. Employees walked past him with downcast eyes. Old friends refused his calls. Even his most trusted business partner, the one who had stood beside him through every deal, pulled away. And then the final blow came. A leaked video surfaced. The security footage from the restaurant, the slap, his mother's face, the horror in the eyes of those around him. It was everywhere. News channels, social media, headlines ripping him apart. Billionaire Richard Alden, caught in shocking footage. Violence against his own mother. Millionaire's reputation, destroyed after disturbing restaurant incident. Richard Alden, a man without a heart. It didn't matter how much money he had, how powerful he thought he was. He couldn't stop the storm that followed. Sponsors pulled their contracts. Investors backed out. His company's board of directors called for an emergency meeting, and just like that, Richard Alden, once untouchable, was drowning. But the worst part wasn't losing the money. It wasn't losing the deals, the respect, the power. It was that for the first time in his life, he was completely alone. He sat in his penthouse, staring at the city skyline. The same skyline he had once believed he owned. Now, it just felt distant, like it belonged to someone else. His phone lay beside him. silent. The calls had stopped. The messages had stopped. The world had moved on. And then, as if the universe wasn't done punishing him yet, his doorbell rang. A sound that once wouldn't have fazed him now sent a shiver down his spine. He moved cautiously, his breath shallow. As he peered through the peephole, his stomach dropped. It was her, Margaret, his mother. He hesitated before opening the door. She stood there, looking smaller than he remembered, wrapped in a simple coat, her silver hair pinned neatly back. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, in a voice far softer than he deserved, she said, "May I come in?" He stepped aside wordlessly. She walked in, taking slow, careful steps, looking around the lavish space. It was the first time she had ever stepped foot in his penthouse, but she didn't comment on it. She just turned to face him, her tired eyes holding something he hadn't seen in years. Not anger, not disappointment, just sadness. She set a small paper bag on his table. "I brought you some food," she said. "I figured you probably haven't been eating much." Richard swallowed. The lump in his throat was unbearable. He didn't deserve this kindness. Not after what he had done. Not after how he had treated her. He sat down across from her, his hands shaking slightly. As he unwrapped the food, the smell hit him instantly. Warm, familiar. She had made him his favorite meal, the same one she used to make when he was a boy, after he had a bad day at school or lost a soccer game. For the first time in years, something inside him cracked. "I lost everything," he whispered. His voice was hoarse, almost unrecognizable. Margaret looked at him, her expression unreadable. "No," she said gently. "You threw everything away." The words stung, but they were true. He had spent his whole life chasing power, money, status, thinking that was what made him important, thinking that it made him untouchable. And in doing so, he had sacrificed the one thing that truly mattered. Her. "I'm sorry," he choked out, the words barely escaping his lips. "I don't deserve your forgiveness. I don't even know why you're here." Margaret's eyes softened. "Because you're my son." Richard squeezed his eyes shut, feeling something he hadn't felt in years. Regret. Not just for the slap, but for everything. For pushing her away. For valuing money over love. For forgetting what really mattered. When he opened his eyes again, his mother was still there, sitting with him. She wasn't asking for anything. She wasn't punishing him. She was just there.